Okay, so we've just finished 16th century in Italy. We're rewinding a little bit. I alluded to the Protestant Reformation while we were talking about High Renaissance Italy. But now let's talk about it. Looking here, you can see kind of the makeup of the different nations at this time. And in these northern nations, we're going to start referring to what we call as Germany. But if you look at the map, there is no nation known as Germany. It's the Holy Roman Empire, which it sometimes spreads across all of Western Europe. Here, Spain and Portugal and France are carving a piece out. But we still have this sizable nation. But it's made up by a number of German princes. So we call them by ethnicity they are German, even if they're not nationally a country yet. Protestant Reformation will be a revolution that splits the church, produces 100 years of civil war between Protestant and Catholic churches. And what happens is Martin Luther, who's a German theologian, he's looking at the front of the excesses of the church, especially the remodeling of St. Peter's by Julius, by the sale of indulgences, by all these things that he sees as immodest spending of money and corrupt spending of money by the person in charge. So he gets frustrated enough that in 1577 he's going to write 95 things he finds wrong with the Catholic Church. And he goes to the door of his local cathedral, Wittenberg, which you can see up there in the kind of right-hand corner of upper right-hand corner of the Holy Roman Empire. And he's going to nail it to the Wittenberg Cathedral. Among this, his criticisms, he claims that the Catholic Church has no biblical authority. He even goes so far as to declare the Pope the Antichrist. He declares the church the whore of Babylon, and says that the ordained priests and the sacraments are obstacles to salvation, which is pretty strong language. This goes viral, as it were, but it spreads like wildfire across Western Europe, particularly in the north. And we'll see a number of thinkers who will protest the authority of the Catholic Church. So this is where the word Protestant comes from. They're protesting against the dominant religious group. What we're going to see is the foundation of various religions. And here's why. Because central to all of these criticisms that Luther levels against the Catholic Church is the question of how salvation is to be achieved. And Martin Luther is going to declare that it is achieved by faith alone. You don't need the priest. You don't need to approach Peter to get to Christ. You can just go directly to him. You can have faith immediately in Christ. And you have faith in the sole authority of the Bible. The Bible is the person in charge, or the thing in charge, not the Pope. Again, we've just had in the past century the establishment of the printing press by Gutenberg, and so we have books that are getting in the hands of people. The Bible isn't just reserved for the priest class because it's such a precious, expensive item. It's still pretty precious and it's still pretty expensive, but we're seeing Bibles start moving into the hands of everybody at this point. As part of the Protestant Reformation, there will be a big push to translate the Bible into the common tongue. And so that just regular Joe Schmoes benefited, who can now read grace of this push for literacy out of the Renaissance, that they can read the Bible for themselves. You didn't realize what a privilege it was to have that Bible, to have those scriptures, but this is a privilege that people died for at this moment, as we have the Inquisition coming on, and several people are going to work on that translation, are going to be martyred in the process. Now, of course, if the Bible is the only authority, eventually each reformer is going to interpret the Bible a little bit differently. So while we have the one Catholic Church in Western Europe, we're going to have a number of Protestant churches who are going to interpret the Bible a little bit differently as they protest against the Pope. Um, Lutheranism, the followers of Martin Luther. Luther never claimed to be a prophet or a head of the church, but as he's going to push people to approach Christ directly and to read the Bible. We see a foundation of religion called Lutheranism. It's going to hold sway in Denmark, in Norway, Sweden, the Holy Roman Empire, parts of Switzerland. But we'll see another major religion come about in response to this. The followers of John Calvin. Calvin interprets things a little bit differently. He believes in a doctrine of predestiny, that your salvation is predestined before you come to this earth. There's a certain number who are saved. And so this is a doctrine that will hold sway in Geneva, in France, the Netherlands, and Scotland. We'll have the Anabaptists in the British Isles. Will be those followers who believe in baptism by immersion. In France, we call Protestants the Huguenots. In England, we'll talk about Henry VIII. Henry VIII wants to divorce his wife. He can't get divorced in the Catholic Church, so he's going to found a new religion. And we'll see Anglican, or the Church of England, get established as a Protestant church at this time. So lots of different religions that are going to grow up in the north of Europe at this time. So when we talk about high Renaissance in the north, the Protestant Reformation is the dominant dialogue. We're going to find it. Eventually, this idea of humanism from Italy is going to filter up to Northern Europe as well. And we're going to get a very specific form of humanism in Northern Europe. We call it Christian humanism. They will be dedicated to studying classical knowledge and works, just like they did in the South, but they're more concerned with reconciling humanism with Christianity. So they believe in this individual potential of man, but we don't want to, in our potential, become like the god Zeus. We want to become more like Christ. They're trying to fit it more neatly within Christian doctrine. And we'll look at what that means, particularly as we look at a self-portrait by Albert Dürer. Well, before we get there, I want to go to this piece by Matthias Grunewald, which is one of my very, very favorite works of art. The Isenheim altarpiece. It's an altarpiece that has multiple parts, so this is when it's closed. But those center panels that have Christ in the center will open up, and they open up in a series of panels. But we're going to look at one of the interior panels in a second. Grunewald's a brilliant colorist. Northern Renaissance always has been. That visual heritage of stained glass windows has yielded this very brightly rich colored art, and Matthias Grunewald is going to use those colors to his advantage here. It's created for a monastery of ascetic monks who lived this quiet life. But in the midst of the world, there is a disease that runs rampant around this monastery. It's called St. Anthony's fire, is the common term for it, but it's ergotism. But it's a disease that is caused by a fungus that grows on rye bread. And when you eat that fungus, which might seem weird to us, but was very common at the time, it's hard to preserve food. And so they'd eat this rye bread, eat the fungus, and it would cause just this fearsome skin disease. And so this monastery became this popular pilgrimage spot for people suffering or fearing such skin infirmities. So if you are suffering from ergotism, you would come to the monastery at Isenheim. And before the priest would begin healing medical treatments, you would start by confronting this altarpiece and confronting this crucified Christ. And so we see this gruesome, gruesome Christ. We'll come back, but I want to show a little bit. On the left, you can see some of that color using to have Christ who's suffering this skin disease. You can see all the boils and lesions on the skin, and that terrible, almost neon red that's spilling out of his wounds, and those very dead blue lips. I'll come back to the front. So there's just this awful, awful image of Christ, who not only is dying on that cross in dramatic ways, you see that pain and tension in those flayed fingers up there on top, but that body is broken. But he also seems to be suffering from ergotism. He's suffering from a skin disease. Everything that you feel in this life, he feels. It comes to him on the Christ. So even as you are suffering from St. Anthony's fire, Christ understands and is suffering from ergotism as well. And so they'd have this dramatic encounter with Christ. They'd see to the left, we've got Mary fainting as her son's in pain, John the Beloved who's grabbing her. And if we look at the panels to the right and the left, we see on the right is St. Anthony, who's identified with miraculous cure. On the left is St. Sebastian, who is appealed to as a ward of disease. And below, you've got Christ who's been taken off the cross, and that panel in the middle splits in the center, which is what often happened of people suffering from ergotism, is their legs would have to be amputated as that skin decays, as he decomposes while alive. And that's what we see in Christ, is these thorns of the lash have studded his skin, agony in those hands and in the feet. The cross arms bends under his weight as he hangs so heavily on that cross. Black, blood red, acid yellow, green of death, all of these colors making this horrific image of Christ, who serves to be this image of Alma 7. Now, they're not basing it on Alma 7, but in my head it's Alma 7, that Christ will suffer according to the flesh, so he knows how to succor his people. Christ is suffering the same things that these poor people coming to this hospital at the monastery are suffering. He understands you. He knows what you're going through. And then you could go receive your treatments for St. Anthony's fire. Now, on Sunday, Christmas, and particularly on Easter Sunday, these panels would open. And on the seeing interior, we have these images of this beautiful life of Christ. Gabriel talking to Mary on the left, the Nativity. As we move over right, and if we get to the far right, we see the most fantastic and triumphant Christ. And I wanted to compare these two. Christ decomposing on the left, Christ cleaned and made whole, and rising out of the tomb in a very almost Wrinkle in Time, science fiction-y sort of way. He's broken the tomb. Those Roman soldiers and the pains of the world are falling apart, and he's up into the sky and becomes part. He's got the stigmata, which is the wounds on his hands that remain, but we almost see light emanating forth from that stigmata. We're trying to appeal to and comfort the viewer. Though you might feel like the Christ on the left, there is hope of healing. There is hope in the resurrection, because that's what Christ, who understands you, offers you. This is Albrecht Dürer's self-portrait. And how does he fashion himself? Well, he looks a whole lot like Christ in this image, doesn't he? This Albrecht Dürer is an artist. He feels that Northern Renaissance art is crude, is what he calls it. So he's going to head down to Italy to study art. He's commonly known as the Leonardo of the North. While he's in Italy, he studies humanism and humanistic principles and is going to bring that idea up to the Northern Renaissance. Like Leonardo, he's going to write theoretical treatises on a variety of subjects, such as perspective, the ideal and human proportions. And while Leonardo raises the image of the artist from a craftsman to a gentleman of the upper class, Dürer's pushing it a little bit up. He's bringing that artist to a divine level. Here he is as a stand-in for Christ, quite visually, not just philosophically like Michelangelo did, but visually Albrecht Dürer appears here as Christ. He's got these long tangled curls. This beard, and even especially in that hand that is fingering his fur-lined jacket, but it seems very much to be an image of blessing, just like we commonly see Christ. Very frontal portrait, like portraits of Christ would have been. And he signs it Albrecht Dürer of Nuremberg, age 28. He's this creative genius with divine inspiration that's bestowed on him by Christ. This is Christian humanism. This is his potential to become like Christ. That here he sees that we've got humanism, the individual potential of man, but it's reconciled within the Christian dialogue. Dürer quotes, I love his AD in the corner. He's going to kind of pioneer that initials as signature that we see employed other places. Dürer will say, the more we know, the more we resemble the likeness of Christ, who truly knows all things. That's this northern brand of humanism. We approach Christ, we become like Christ through acquiring knowledge. Now, you can see kind of the stamp of the Protestant Reformation on the foundation of America a little bit. That's kind of a very United States idea, that we rise up and become better through education, through knowledge. We become like Christ. The more we know, the more we resemble the likeness of Christ, who truly knows all things. Albrecht Dürer is one of the first artists to work seriously in engravings. Engravings they're invented here in Germany. They've existed for quite some time. It's a printmaking method where you have a metal plate, and they're going to draw on the metal plate with acid, which is going to burn parts of it away. So then when you roll ink over it, you can put a piece of paper, roll that on top of the ink and pull it away, and you have an image, but you still have a plate that you can make an additional print. You can make as many prints as you want, as long as you have, the original is the plate. So there is no, the original is the method. There's no one original work of art. I still have engravings. I buy engravings today for the reason that they are cheap. There's no one original. There's lots of originals. So they're less expensive. They're the kind of the art of the masses. But they're not used seriously in art until Dürer. What they've been used for before is for the art of the masses, or pornography. That's the art that the masses partakes in. And so they've been pornographic prints up to this point. Well, Dürer sees the potential of this very German art form. And so instead of making pornographic prints, he's going to use it and talk about very high things like the creation of Adam and Eve, the fall of man, and elevate the conversation a little bit. Now, what is Italian Renaissance about this? Well, one, we've got these nude forms. We're interested in anatomy, the subject matter that we've seen in the Italian Renaissance before. But while he claims German art is crude, you can certainly see its influence on here. One, just in their face, don't they kind of just look German? We've got this heavy cultural figure, and they're standing in a forest with identifiable plants, which seems very northern as well. And it's heavy on the symbolism, which is also very northern. Now you've got Adam standing by the tree of knowledge, this wise parrot that's perched, while Adam receives an apple from a serpent in a fig tree. The fig was associated with the fall, and used fig leaves to make aprons after the fall. And then just strict symbolism. It was believed at the time that the fall unleashes the humors or temperaments in us. Humors were believed to be fluids in the body that produced our temperament. There were 4 humors. And they're symbolized by these 4 animals down in the lower third of the image. You had the choleric cat. The cat was symbol of this yellow bile that was released from the liver. It prompted feelings of pride or wrath. You had the melancholic elk. It was a black bile released by the liver. It prompted vices of despair and avarice or greed, and brought on this humor of melancholy. The sanguine rabbit, which was produced by an overly active blood circulation, bringing overly active, sensuous, and fertile feelings, resulting in lust. And then you had the phlegmatic ox, which phlegm was carried by the lungs. It resulted in laziness, the vices of gluttony and sloth. So the fall of Adam released all of these humors into the world. And so we see these symbols, these animals down in the lower third who are set free because of this fall. So definitely bringing up this humanistic subject matter, interest in anatomy down from Italy. We've got this very northern stamp on it. This is Durer's last major painting, The Four Apostles, and it's got this very Protestant stamp on it because we see four apostles. Now, four apostles are still important. They're all in the Bible there. But the apostle on the left is John, and he's kind of takes preeminence, while Peter is kind of shunted, and he looks old and decrepit and shoved into the background. Peter being a symbol of the Catholic Church and their authority. John in his writings becomes kind of the symbol of Protestantism. And he happens to be Luther's favorite evangelist due to his teachings on the nature and person of Christ. So instead, his traditional attribute is a chalice, but instead of the chalice, we're putting a book in his hands. And the book is open to the words, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." What's key to all Protestant religions? Faith in Christ, faith in the Word, who are the same thing. The Bible is the Word. It's this tangible image of Christ on earth. In the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was with God. In other words, John's word as written in the Bible is true. The declarations of the papacy are often in error. We see on the right, Paul looks menacingly at the viewer. And down below you can see written a whole bunch of text. And it's a lot of scriptures. There's introductory text given for it, which reads, "All worldly rulers in these dangerous times should give good heed that they receive not human misguidance for the word of God. For God will have nothing added to his word, nor taken away from it. Hear therefore these four excellent men, Peter, John, Paul, and Mark, and their writing." And then he includes verses from each of these four evangelists that warn against false prophets, blasphemers, false accusers, traitors, false scribes who don't understand the word of God. It's a very pointed attack, right? We don't want to add anything to the Bible. We get to God by faith in the Bible alone. Don't add anything to it, including all these sacraments, including all these priests, including all this gold in your churches, including this fundraiser for St. Peter's, including this humanistic, complicated connection between Venus and Mary. And these are all these things that they see the traditional church adding to the Word of God. I just love the title of this piece, "The Great Piece of Turf." That's God's creation, right? We're going to focus on this piece. It's enough. The creations of God, this little piece, little dandelions, is enough that it's given all this honor and authority. And as such, it kind of becomes this mathematical study of a little space of weeds, a scientific botanical study, just like Leonardo might have done. Here we see the Battle of Issus by Albrecht Altdorfer. And don't you just see the traditional realism in particular still holding sway here? This was a piece that was commissioned by Duke Wilhelm of Bavaria. He was busy fighting a battle against the Turks. The Ottoman Turks were invading Austria at this time. And so he does this story of the Greeks versus the Persians. Alexander the Great fighting Darius in the Battle of Issus. Alexander wins. So of course we're in Europe. We see ourselves as the descendants of Alexander against this invading army coming from the east, who they'll equate to the Ottoman Turks. Altdorfer's text was a contemporary historian writing an anti-Turkish history of the world. He tells that after defending the Hellenistic borders, Alexander encounters Persian military camps. They fight all day, this dramatic battle involving 1 million soldiers. And we see it's really an anti-Islamic text, dating all the way back here to 1529. And so we see the rising sun of Christianity that's taking over this departing moon of Islam off to the side. So the event, as well as the setting and action, is we have this little battle, but it's becoming a 1 million person battle, which is becoming this battle on the earth. And we see kind of that horizon line as the globe of the earth is about to turn over. This contemporary event taking on these cosmic proportions. And you still see that legacy of the miniature, that realism in particular, individual foot soldiers, cavalry, bannerets, the dead, the debris, encampments, preparations, all these details kind of get lost and they're insignificant in this cosmic humanistic saga. The cosmos are at war, and humanity, nature, and God all participate. We're going to move to a couple different countries at this point. Hans Holbein, he needs a patron. Now, the problem is if you get rid of the Pope, you attack the Pope, and who's spending all this money on art, who's your new patron? Where do you go? Well, we're going to go to the biggest royal authority at this time, and that's up in England. Henry VIII is a powerful English king. He wants to divorce his wife. He's going to found his own church, which is basically just Catholicism, except he can get divorced. And so he's going to have a series of wives, but he's doling out money. And so Hans Holbein will go hang out in England. There's Christian humanists who are in the court of Henry VIII, Erasmus, Sir Thomas More, and so he'll hang out with them too. And here we see him painting the French ambassadors. These are the two ambassadors from France to England, John de Tintville and this church father, and they're presenting themselves. So that we see them fashioning themselves to the English government. And how are they presenting themselves? Well, one, they're wealthy. Even that church father's very humble robes look velvet. We see this elaborate pattern and fur-lined robe. So they look sophisticated and wealthy, but they're not just shallow money gatherers, right? They're good, thoughtful thinkers. And so we see all of their different elements showing that they are humanists, that they're men of understanding. So the upper shelf, well, and part of that, you see that Persian rug. Persian rugs are still really expensive. They're still going to cost about $10,000 if you go buy a real Persian rug. And they certainly were at the time to get rugs from Persia. And by Persia, we're just talking about the East at this point. But east of Western Europe, you have to go across a Silk Road. They'll start doing traveling and sailing, but it's imported from a different country, which makes it a really valuable rug. On top, we see these items for measuring the skies. You see kind of this globe of the known universe. We've got astrolabes, we've got compasses, all these items of learning. And on that lower shelf, we see things of the earth, a globe of the earth, a lute, studying music, studying poetry and literature. All these different images to show how fabulous, how wealthy, how sophisticated, how learned these two French ambassadors are. Down in the bottom, we see a really interesting inclusion, and that is this skull, which is distorted. If you stand to the side of this image, this skull kind of composes itself. You can recognize it as a skull, but here it becomes a swath across the front. Now here's the trick. They're presenting themselves as wealthy, learned men. What did we just get mad at Italy and the Pope for being? Wealthy, humanistic people. And so we see this really interesting dichotomy set up in the North, where we want to be wealthy because it's fun, but our religion kind of tells us we shouldn't be. And so we're going to see the development of this, what we call the embarrassment of riches. They're rich, they just really shouldn't be, because they just had a whole revolution where they broke off from the Catholic Church. And so while we're going to show you all these things of the world that we've acquired that make us important, we're going to remind ourselves that we're all going to die, and that's what the skull's for. It's called a vanitas image, this reminder of death. It's not going to last. This stuff is great to have in life as long as you remember that none of it matters. If you remember none of it matters, then you can feel free to gather whatever stuff you want. And that's the purpose of that skull across the front. France is an interesting place at this time. France stays Catholic. You have pockets of Huguenots or French Protestants, but they're pretty well criticized and persecuted because the dominant prevailing religion is going to be France. France has this growing powerful monarch appearing on the scene. And so it is in their best interest to remain Catholic. They believe very strongly in divine right, that the king is the king because God gives him the power to rule. He is stand-in for Christ in ruling France. So we don't want to become Protestant. That takes away the power of the king. And so they don't necessarily want to give it up. Now, in Italy at the time, who they are loyal to religiously, but we see Mannerism taking hold. And in France, we want an expensive, pretty sensual art, and Mannerism just fills the bill. And so that's what we'll see the dominant style here. I love this portrait done by Jean Clouet. The patron is Francis I. Where's the focus? We're talking Leonardo's self-fashioning focus on the eyes. In Clouet's portrait of Francis I, it's not a self-portrait, but it is a portrait fashioned to be attractive to Francis. But what's the focus? Well, it's that fabulous shirt he's wearing. That's where all the attention is on the wealth and detail and embroidery, the gaudiness of this fantastic shirt. That's what gets the focus, because that's what's pleasing to Francis I. And if you go to Francis I's palace at Fontainebleau, we see this elegant style of Mannerism coming forth. Very sensual portraits of Madonnas looking quite attractive. And it's gaudy, it's elaborate, it's everything that the French want it to be at this time. Interesting place is what we're going to call the Dutch Republic. We're going to see revolution, one of our very first revolutions. Spain is in charge at this point. For a while, Spain, Charles V is the king of the Spain, and he's the king of the Holy Roman Empire. So he's essentially king of the north. And we'll see them in charge of a country called Flanders. But the north part of Flanders is going to revolt, declare independence from Spain. So we see our very first country get established that is independent from a royal authority. And it's a republic, Dutch Republic. And so here in the Dutch Republic, they are Calvinist. And so they've kind of rejected art in churches. And we're gonna and they're pretty wealthy. We're gonna see grow out of the Dutch Republic the Dutch East Indies Trading Company, the establishment of the Bank of Netherlands, the true establishment of our first middle class. And so you have some people, they've got some money to spend. We don't want elaborate altarpieces in our churches. So we have artists who need to fill a different niche. One that can't be too expensive art, but it's got to be art that's of interest to the middle class. And so we see the establishment of a very new genre, which is called the genre scene. It's scenes of everyday life. So here's the money changer and his wife. This isn't Mary and Gabriel or anything. This is just a run-of-the-mill guy doing his best to make money, and his wife is reading the Bible, attending to things of beyond, while he attends to the things of the earth. And inscribed into the scene is, "Let thy weights balance, thy measures be just." And so he's doing his best to live this normal, good, honest life. He's a money changer. Now, while we have genre scenes that aren't overtly religious, there's always a religious moral to the story. So while they're trying to do their best to be good, honest, upstanding citizens, if you look out the corner, we see these two kind of tattlers gossiping out the window. And so we can lambast them and talk about how immoral they are while holding up the money changer. Realism in particulars, it doesn't die, does it? Look at those coins, the details on them, even the reflection of that glass. A little mirror where we see a self-portrait of the artist in the little details. I love even that plate up on the shelf and all of its details. It's a pretty modest house, but still see some expensive, elaborate things as this middle class seeing themselves reflected in these genre scenes. Peter Ertson, A Meat Still Life. Still lifes are going to grow in popularity. We'll talk about it a lot in the coming weeks. But still lifes, especially these genre scenes, I don't have a lot of money to buy fancy things, but oil painting just basically recreates fancy things for me. So I can put still lifes on the wall and it looks almost as if I own all of this fancy stuff. But, it's not good to own a lot of stuff, so we'll end up with rotting images in it. And so we see, just like these Antwerp housewives shopping on Saturday morning, we get to peruse all the cuts of beef and pig that are available for us this morning. It's all going to rot, it's all going to disappear, but for this moment, we're reminded of everything that we can have. And so we see two scenes that become our moral of the story in our genre scenes. So over the right background, we see people being gluttonous, just force-feeding themselves in the background corner. And then we have this figure that's dumping out these oyster shells. Oyster shells were known as an aphrodisiac. So we have this image of gluttony and lust, whereas on the left, the flight into Egypt's happening. There's Mary and Jesus ready to take off, head into Egypt, and pointing to them and the fish down on the silver dish below, we see this image of the cross. And they're heading back in the very left-hand background scene. There's an image of a cathedral or a church. Sorry, probably not a cathedral at this point, but a church raising up into the sky. So don't be like the people in the background of the right. Be like the people on the left. And as long as you've had your moral lesson, you can feel free to admire all the stuff that you can purchase and be a little bit worldly. You've reminded yourself it's not okay to be worldly. It's this funny dialogue in this embarrassment of riches. Peter Bruegel the Elder. We see this very naturalistic genre, seeing these hunters in the snow, returning home on this cold, overcast day. Not a lot of shadows that are cast as they have this cloud cover. And we as the viewer get this bird's eye perspective. We're looking down at this image and see this bustling life down below. I love the people ice skating. This city life that even though it's cold, we get this image of we get to be kind of like God surveying our land, the bustle of humanity down on earth. Bruegel is famous for this piece, his Netherlandish proverbs. A proverb is a catchy saying like a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Don't beat yourself up about it. All these kind of sayings, proverbs that we say over and over to remind us. Well, he's created this image that's almost this Where's Waldo of Netherlandish proverbs. Some are still common to us today. Others we're not aware of. For example, beating your head against the wall, you can see down in that left-hand corner. And he's put over 100 proverbs that he's packed into this. So you get kind of this lesson and all the common knowledge of wisdom of the day. And before we end, I just want to pull in this piece by El Greco. El Greco is from Spain. Spain is very Catholic. Spain's more Catholic than Rome is Catholic, if that's possible. And so we see Manneristic art, late Renaissance art, particularly in the clashing colors here. The bright oranges and yellows with these kind of acrid greens and colors that clash and don't fit very well in Count Orgaz, who's being received up into heaven above. Why I do want to bring up El Greco is to tell you a little bit about Spain, because this, during the High Renaissance, this is Spain's golden era. 1492, that's when we're going to see Ferdinand and Isabella send Columbus across the world, and that's, you know, the century following it is going to be Columbus and all of the explorers bringing back their wealth to Spain. They're conquering the new world, is what they call it, and we'll see all sorts of gold and different items and exciting finds from the new world being funneled back to Spain at this point. So Spain is living high, conquering the world during this time. Okay, that finishes up our discussion of the Northern Renaissance.